How many concussions is too many concussions? This is one we get tons. Like I said, a parent asked me this last night. Their kid had had 2 previous concussions, and they were really concerned about, what happens if they get a 3rd one or a 4th one or a 5th one. And they actually have taken them out of all contact hockey out of fear of concussions and how many is too many. And the answer is that we don't really know. They used to say that if you had had a certain number of concussions, like 3 or 4 concussions, then you'd be like, pulled out of sports and whatever else. But there actually isn't a magic number for people. The best way to describe this, really, as far as what we know, it seems to be more related to not the number of concussions you've had, but the recovery that you've had between each of those concussions. So I'll take this back now to some of the animal studies that have been done in this area, where they will subject a mouse or a rat to repetitive concussions to try and see, what happens at various, time points of the recovery, et cetera, et cetera. And what they find is that actually one of my favorite studies to quote on this, I think it was Meehan, and this is a few years ago, but they had 3 groups of mice, actually 4 groups of mice. First group was, let's say, a sham group that didn't have any type of impact delivered. The second group was a group that had a concussion every single day for 5 consecutive days. The next group was a group that had a concussion every single week for 5 consecutive weeks. And the third group was a group that had a concussion every single month for 5 consecutive months. Now, the recovery of a concussion in a rat from an energy deficit, concussion causes an energy deficit within the brain. For a rat, that's about a 5 to 7 day kind of process, so about that 1 week mark. For humans, it's much, much longer. It's about 3 to 6 weeks, somewhere in there. Now, what the researchers wanted to see was what the long-term effects were and also what the acute effects were. The group that had a concussion every single day for 5 days was still impaired 1 month later compared to the sham group. And then even 1 year later, that group was still impaired compared to the sham group. The group that had a concussion every single week for 5 weeks tended to be worse, but it wasn't statistically significant. The group that had a concussion every single month for 5 months was no different than a group that had never received a concussion, both at the acute stage, 1 month after their final injury, and 1 year after their final injury. So we have no acute effects. We also have no long-term effects. So it's not necessarily the number of concussions you get. It's more so what the recovery was like between each of those successive concussions. Now, if we take that and say the animal recovery is a 5-day process, the human recovery is a 3 to 6 week process, the fact that we are going through this symptom-based approach to clearing people, symptom-based approach to injury management, means that we're constantly putting athletes at risk for having subsequent concussions during that vulnerable period where those injuries can be cumulative and too close together. Right? We want to be getting closer to that, 3 to 6 week mark before we're clearing an injured athlete, rather than what we're currently doing, which is the 1 to 2 week mark. That's right in the middle of that recovery time. That is when dangerous things are happening. And that's why I think we're seeing these problems in professional sports. What I always say is, do we have a concussion problem, or do we have a concussion management problem? It's my speculation that it's more a management problem. We are clearing athletes too soon, and that's why concussions are becoming a long-term problem for athletes as they go through life. So not necessarily the number of concussions you get, but what your recovery is like between each of those concussions, making sure that the athlete is fully recovered, not just from a symptom standpoint, but also from a metabolic energy deficit standpoint. This is when things like objective testing, comprehensive baselines, assessing various physical and cognitive levels can help you to understand when that person is safer to go back to their sport.